Thank you very much. Welcome you to the forum, the Institute of Politics, and as I say, it's a great honor and privilege for me to be the director of this fine institute, and tonight we have a fine program, but I just want to say a quick word. You knew I would. There he is again. Now, my father, Millward L. Simpson, came to the United States Senate in 1962, and one Birch Bayh was there. Birch Bayh and my father were quite close, considering that they did not see eye to eye on various issues of the day, but they were both Alpha Tau Omega fraternity. Now, don't throw anything. I know that those are not always the most famous things in these times, but Birch Bayh was one of the outstanding people that had ever been honored by that particular fraternity. These were the old days. As I say, political correctness was not in the fore in those times. And my father thoroughly enjoyed Birch Bayh. Then I came to the U.S. Senate, and Dad said, "Get to know Birch Bayh. He's a great guy." And Birch was on the Judiciary Committee when I came, and he couldn't have been more helpful, more courteous, more kind, and more of a counselor to me. And now comes this fine son, and I have gotten to know Evan, and the apple does not fall far from the tree. And it is a great pleasure to have you here, but it's not my opportunity to introduce Evan. It is Michael Porter, who is, of course, a professor of business administration here at Harvard and a wonderful record himself. And thank you, Porter, Michael, for doing this. Appreciate it very much.
Well, we have a very limited amount of time this evening, and I'd like Evan to take most of it. I just want to very briefly welcome all of you to the forum this evening. I think you're in for a treat. I happen to be a Republican. I think Evan Bayh is one of the most exciting political leaders in America. I'm privileged to have known him now for several years and to work with him in a variety of contexts. He has a remarkable record as a governor, one of the best, if not the best, over the last decade or two. He's a person who has gotten things done in budget balancing and welfare reform and investment in improving education and addressing kind of the issues of our times. He's a leader who is able to work with lots of different kinds of people across party lines and political lines and ethnic lines towards a higher purpose. And so I think there's no more interesting person to kind of reflect on some of the political issues of the time than Evan, and I'm anxious to hear what he has to say. One of the themes we thought would be of particular interest tonight, given that Evan has been a governor and now is embarking on this process of hoping to become a senator, would be to kind of reflect on this question of the federal-state relationship. But I know Evan likes to take questions, so I'm sure he'll give you plenty of chances to take this forum in any way that you wish. So with that, Evan, welcome, and we're delighted to have you at Harvard.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm grateful to Michael Porter for his very gracious introduction. Michael is someone I've admired for many years. He and Debbie are personal friends of Susan and mine, and what can you say about someone who has an IQ of probably 150 and has a golfing handicap of about 5, but someone I'd like to emulate. And I am thankful to Michael for his contributions to the public policy discussion, not only here in our country, but around the world. He's someone I admire a great deal, and I appreciate your kindness in introducing me tonight. Senator Simpson, you were very gracious as always. Our fathers served together, and I know my father has a great deal of respect and fondness for you. It was at a time when we seemed to have a more civil level of discourse in our political process. I, for one, hope that's a time we can return to, where people can have honest differences of opinion without personalizing them unduly, and I want to thank you for your leadership and extend to you the best wishes from my family. Also, Phil Sharp, former congressman, 20 years in the Congress. That's more punishment than anybody should have to be subjected to. But a great leader. not only for Indiana, but across the country, and Harvard is lucky to have one of Indiana's finest. And Phil, to you, I appreciate your being here. And of course, to Chris Letts, who's sitting down front here. Chris was the first director of the Department of Transportation in my administration, my first administration, and just did a wonderful job. Proof she'd come from the private sector, Cummins engine, proof that sound financial management, good quality practices can be put to work in the public sector, and just did a tremendous job on behalf of the taxpayers of Indiana. And Chris, I'm very proud of you. You know, when you're governor, you get credit for a lot of things that other people really have accomplished, and Christine Letts is one of those people. So, Chris, to you, I'm very grateful as well. And for I suspect we have not everyone here tonight from Indiana. We probably have a few residents of the state of Massachusetts. And to you, I say, I appreciate your returning Larry Bird to us. So we're very grateful that he has now been repatriated and leading our Indiana Pacers to one of the best records in the NBA. So I'm grateful to you for that. I am going to, let me say a couple of things by way of introductions. When you leave the governorship, it can be it's a real test for your ego and your sense of self. You know, you're the center of attention for 8 years. You're the governor of the state. You're not off in Washington. The public policy debate tends to revolve around you. People know who you are. You're in the press all the time. And then suddenly, boom, you just go cold turkey. You don't live in the residence anymore, and a lot of the trappings of power are suddenly gone. It's one of the great, I was thinking about that as we were swearing in my successor, who had served as lieutenant governor for 8 years. He's a very fine man, but I was thinking about what a wonderful reflection it is on our democracy that we have a peaceful transfer of power like that. And you're driven to the inaugural by the state police, and you drive yourself home. It's an interesting and very abrupt transition. And so 10 days later, to kind of help ease things over, Susan and I went to the inaugural in Washington for President Clinton's second inaugural, and we went to all the festivities, and I was feeling pretty good about things. We came home, no state police. So we hail a cab and get into this cab, and the cabbie asks for our address. I give him our new home address, and he does one of these double takes in the rearview mirror. And I kind of nudge my wife. I said, see, they still know me. They still love me. This is a great thing. I'm feeling pretty good. And so he keeps looking in the rearview mirror. You can kind of read his thoughts. He sort of knows who this is in the back of his cab, but it's not quite there yet. And so finally, his face lights up. He gets this broad smile. He's figured it out, and he can't resist letting me know. He's identified who he's driving in his cab. And he looks at me, he says, in the rearview mirror, he says, "Hey, mister." He said, "I know who you are. You're Dan Quayle." So I've learned to never take introductions for granted, Michael. No cases of mistaken identity tonight. One other thing I'll say, and then I will give my brief remarks, and then I'd really like to answer your questions here tonight. This is a very accomplished audience, and so rather than just listen to myself, I'd rather address what you're interested in. I did, on the occasion of Martin Luther King's birthday a couple of years ago, speak to one of the largest congregations in one of the churches in Indianapolis, and this particular service happened to be broadcast on live radio all across central Indiana, and the minister, very eloquent man, walked up into the pulpit and addressed, there must have been 2,000 people in this church, and addressed both the people who were there in the live radio audience. He cleared his throat and he said, he'd obviously heard me speak before, he said, "Governor, we humbly request that you be strong today, not long today." So I kind of took the hint, and ever since then I've tried to keep my remarks short, and I apologize in advance for needing to leave at 7 o'clock. I had planned to stay longer, frankly wanted to stay longer, but I noticed in my schedule that during this 8-day period, tomorrow morning is my only chance to be with my 2 children, who are twin boys, 2 years and 4 months old, and I just frankly think I need to spend some time with them. So I hope you'll understand if I have to leave a little bit earlier than I would like, but it is for a very important purpose. So let me get to my remarks. I will make them brief and then throw it open for your questions, and please feel free to ask me about anything in addition to what I may touch upon in my remarks this evening. For 8 years, I had the privilege of being the chief executive officer of our state, about 6 million people now, and in the course of that experience had a chance to experience the interrelationship between the state government and the federal government, and the state government and local governments across the state of Indiana. And I have become increasingly convinced that we live at an exciting time for state governments. And I think that the relationship between the state government and the federal government in particular may be in the course of some fairly significant evolutions. And we may be at a time where the federal government is less likely to give prescriptive answers to the states, less likely to micromanage some of the public policy initiatives that we think will accomplish our public objectives in this country, more likely to set standards, more likely to provide resources, more likely to measure progress, and free up the states for one of the purposes for which they were originally intended, and that is for experimentation, innovation, and tailoring the public policy solutions toward common goals in individual ways best suited to the various peoples of the states across our country. That's my thesis tonight, and let me explain to you my thoughts a little bit, and then I'll throw it open for questions. Of course, the role of the states has gone through a variety of phases during the history of our country. During our first incarnation, the Articles of Confederation, the states were largely autonomous. That, of course, quickly proved to be impractical. But even under our first constitutional structure, most of the power in this country was reserved to the states. Those powers not specifically reserved to the federal government were in fact assumed to reside in the states, and that's the way it remained throughout most of the history of our country. War did a lot to help consolidate and focus power at the federal level. First the Civil War, then World War I, World War II. As wars began to be more events of national mobilization, that had a very profound concentrating impact upon the powers and the role of the federal government in our society, which ratcheted up for war and never really did ratchet back down to the state of being that existed before that. Industrial concentration also played a very prominent role, first with the rise of the large manufacturing and industrial powers and trusts at the end of the last century, and of course then the collapse during the Great Depression, and our attempts to revive our economy led to a great deal of additional initiative and power in Washington, D.C. that then lasted largely intact into the 1960s and the early 1970s. Starting under the Nixon administration, terms that were called in those days revenue sharing, then being revived again under the banner of, I believe, new federalism during the Reagan years, and now, over the last several years, under the name of devolution. A great deal of additional attention has been focused upon the role, the appropriate role, and the powers that should be reserved to the states in our federal system. Some of this has been because of budgetary reasons. Frankly, when the federal government began to encounter the severe budgetary problems that we experienced from the 70s through just recently, and if you include entitlements even continuing to this day, the public policy initiatives available to those in Washington were not quite as present as they had previously been. If you agree that you can't run up, as far as the eye can see, large federal budget deficits without doing significant structural harm to our economy, if you agree that you can't rapidly increase the money supply without causing runaway inflation, and if you agree that increasing the burdens upon business through excessive levels of regulation and mandates on the private sector will harm our competitiveness, one of the things you're left with is to turn to other levels of government, state and local governments, and to say, you shall do this, and oh, by the way, you're going to pay for it. And so what we saw in several areas were increasing what they call unfunded federal mandates. Well-intended, and some of which I think were frankly good, but it still placed upon states the obligation of undertaking the funding for these programs, as well as fleshing out many of the initiatives, and I can get into that in greater detail if you're interested. Now that the budgetary pressures have somewhat abated, there are still market forces and ideological reasons underlying this that I think will continue into the future. In an age of international global competition, and Professor Porter and I were discussing this in a different context before coming down here this evening, the importance of flexibility, of implementation, the importance of innovation in solving problems is very, very important. Top-down management, uniform solutions to very complex and varied problems is not working very well these days in the private sector, and I would submit to you it does not work as well as it used to in the public sector either. So I think what we're going to increasingly see, and I'll give you a couple examples here, is the federal government setting standards for our country to achieve to accomplish our public policy objectives as a single nation and to be competitive internationally. But leaving a great deal of flexibility to the states to experiment, to try different ways to achieve those common goals that are most efficient, and also take into account the different character of the different states, which do vary greatly from state to state. Let me give you a couple of examples. I think over time we will see an evolution toward voluntary national education standards in our country. It is vitally important, and this is one thing I would love to talk to you about at some length in the question sector. This is something that I feel I am very concerned about that if we do not significantly improve the quality of education, particularly for the bottom 30 or 40% of our students, we are at serious risk for the first time in the history of our country of becoming a class-based society with a sizable underclass, 20, 25, even 30% of our citizens who are largely locked out of opportunity because in an information, knowledge-based economy, they don't have the skills necessary to compete and succeed in that kind of world. And we simply are not getting the job done well. Now, I don't suggest that the federal government start micromanaging or take over the important local and state role of running education. But I do think there is a legitimate argument to be made in favor of voluntary national education standards in core subjects such as math, basic literacy, some of the basic sciences. And I think you will find over time that some states will begin to buy into those standards, in particular the marketplace, the private sector. If they begin to buy into those standards, which I believe they will, you will then gradually see a coalescing around higher academic, market-based academic standards, which will go a long way toward improving the quality of education across our country. Resources are also important, and I think there's an appropriate federal role to providing resources to states to achieve some of these objectives with oversight in terms of evaluating the progress the states are making while still allowing the requisite flexibility for the states to experiment and try different solutions. An example of that is the recent welfare reform initiative that was enacted by Congress. In our state, we started about 3 years before Congress acted, and through the waiver process achieved the ability, several other states did as well, the ability to try some different things in the state of Indiana. Frankly, we did not choose some of the avenues that had been suggested by some others, but we did go toward a system that was based not so much on income maintenance as one based upon training, job placement, empowerment of citizens to provide for themselves. And in exchange for the helping hand that we gave and that we currently give in terms of training, health care through the Medicaid program, transportation assistance, some of these sorts of things, we did, and we now have a personal responsibility contract that an individual upon AFDC in the state of Indiana must sign as a condition for receiving benefits, pledging to accept a job if one is offered, pledging to complete training when they are enrolled in training, pledging to make sure their children are inoculated against certain diseases, the shots are provided for free, pledging to stay off of illegal drugs, which is a terrible problem in our society, some of these things to keep the bond of opportunity being provided by society, but personal responsibility being provided by the individual in exchange for that opportunity. The results in our state have been fairly dramatic. We have seen, and Massachusetts ranks fairly high as well, has tried some different things. Wisconsin ranks fairly high. We're in the top 3 or 4 states. We've seen a decline of over 40% in the number of citizens in the state of Indiana on AFDC. We now have over the last 3 or 4 years, we now have the lowest welfare rolls in our state in any year since 1972. Now, part of this is because of the very strong economy that makes placing people in entry-level jobs much easier, but I would submit to you part of it is also, and I think this has been borne out by more than anecdotal evidence, part of this is also because of the clear priority we placed upon this and some of the initiatives we instituted as a state because we were given the ability to do that. And so I think looking at national education standards as one model, looking at some continuing standards in the welfare area with a great deal of flexibility for experimentation and innovation in the different states, these will increasingly be models that the federal government will follow in empowering states with resources and some basic standards to start solving some of these basic social problems a little closer to home. To help illustrate this, I will leave you with a story, and then let's get right to your questions. It occurred probably 3 or 4 years into my time as governor. We had gone through a recession and had experienced some budget reductions at the federal level in one of the nutrition programs for senior citizens. And a group of seniors appeared in my lobby. There was no appointment, and they wanted to know if they could come in to see me. They were representing one of the advocacy groups in the Indianapolis area, and I told my secretary, well, you know, they're here, of course, show them on in. And so I listened to what they had to say, and I asked the leader of their group, I said, well, let me understand, this is a federal program, is that correct? And he looked at me and said, well, that's correct. And I said, is there any state money involved in this? And he said, no state money. And I said, well, have you talked to either of our senators? They're both good people. They're pretty empathetic. Have you talked to them about this? And they kind of looked around the group, and they looked at me and they said, well, no, we haven't done that. I said, well, have you talked to our local congressman? He's a very happened to be Andy Jacobs. Phil, he was a very good person. I said, you talked to Andy about this? And they looked around each other. They said, like it hadn't occurred to them. They said, well, no, we haven't done that either. So finally I looked at their leader, and I said, well, can I ask you, why'd you come see me? And they looked around at each other, and the leader looked at me with this quizzical look on his face, and he said, well, you're here. Well, what could I say? He was right. So I said, I'll help you any way I can. So the moral of that story is that for many people in our society, Washington does seem a little remote. And at a time when there's a great deal of skepticism about large institutions, be they governmental, be they corporate, or be they labor, large institutions' ability to efficiently address the challenges that we face, state and local governments, I believe, will be increasingly called upon to implement and to innovate in solutions to the challenge that our society faces. And I think that is perfectly consistent with setting national goals, national standards to meet global challenges that face our country for many years to come. So having said all of that, let me conclude. While I am a candidate for the United States Senate, I'm not currently a member. I don't have the privilege of filibustering, and I will end. Who has the first question for me? And again, I thank you for your hospitality. By the way, one thing before we get to the question, I did intend to start this evening by saying, for those of you who saw my keynote address to the Democratic National Convention, relax. I'm not giving that tonight, and I do appreciate the second chance. So who has the first question?
Yeah. Hello, my name is Michael Pasanti, and I'm a junior at the college. And my question for you is, I'm from New Jersey, right? And okay. in New Jersey, they have some problems with the educational system. I mean, in particular, places like Newark and Camden and whatnot have been sort of underperforming on the standardized tests year after year. And it got so bad that it was to the point where the state government actually went into the local districts and took them over. And my question is for you, what do you do about those cases in which districts are consistently underperforming on that kind of thing?
Well, that's an excellent question, and that goes to the heart of the potential underclass I was talking about, and I think from both an economic as well as a social standpoint is one of the major challenges that our generation will face over the next 20 years. Your first name is Michael?
Yep.
Michael, there is, in my opinion, no easy answer to this. There is no one thing that we can do. And the decline in the quality of education has not occurred overnight, and I suspect will be unlikely to be resolved overnight. But we must try, and I'm convinced we can make progress. I think the first thing we need to do is to institute market-based, competitive academic standards. That's vitally important. There's an old saying that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. We have to determine where it is we want to end up first in mathematics, in science, in language arts, and then we can come up with intelligent decisions about how to best arrive there. So high standards, high academic standards first. Secondly, I think we need a system of assessments, fancy word for examinations, tests, for determining how each student is doing, how schools are doing and districts are doing toward achieving, toward meeting those standards. We did this in my state, and we went to a different kind of exam. It's no longer all multiple choice. It's now half multiple choice, but it's half what they call constructed response. You have to write your answer. You have to explain your reasoning. The teachers, the graders can look and see your thought process, and you get a much more complex understanding of what a student knows or doesn't know from that kind of examination than you do from simply a selected response, multiple choice type of exam. So I think you need what they call authentic examinations that give you a better understanding of how each student is doing. In our case, we also made it a high-stakes exam, which I happen to believe in. Now, that is controversial in some quarters, and I will be happy to talk with you at some length about that. What that means in our state is that unless you pass this achievement examination, you do not receive a high school diploma. We feel that strongly about it, and my own feeling is that you have to have high academic standards, authentic, meaningful examinations to determine how students and schools are doing. There have to be consequences. If there are no consequences, people will not take it seriously. And finally, and most difficultly, and ultimately most importantly, you have to have remedial initiatives to take the students who aren't doing well enough from where they are to where they need to be. In our case, the first time we gave these exams, 46% of the students did not successfully complete them. By the time we're finished, The vast, vast majority of that 46% will be able to successfully complete them because we're going to more summer school, more after-school work, a variety of things, including what they call alternative schools for students who come from difficult backgrounds. There are a variety of things, and in our case, we decided that the state should not have a single answer. We decided that what I'm telling you about the relationship between the federal and state level should also apply to the state and local level. We said, here are the standards, here are the resources. Now at the local level, you are best, because in an inner city area, you mentioned Camden, in our case it might be a Gary or inner city Indianapolis, not going to be the same as a rural area or suburban area. So we decided to have some flexibility with how the local school districts should go about that. So standards, assessments, remedial investment, very important. Let me mention one other thing to you, and I would be happy to let you ask a follow-up question because we could go on and on. It's a very complicated and broad topic. If you follow the research in these areas, there's the whole science of the development of the human brain is really progressing very rapidly. And there are some indications now that some basic attributes of the human mind are formed at a much earlier age than we had previously understood to be the case. Last year, a study came out indicating that perhaps as early as 1 year old, some of our basic reasoning and mathematical abilities may be largely in place. If true, that poses some very profound implications for public policy, which are not easily resolved. On the one hand, it does argue, particularly for people from less fortunate areas, that we should make available to them developmentally appropriate activities for children at a very early age, that we should empower parents of newborns with the knowledge of what they need to do to be good parents, to see that their children develop in ways that will stimulate the mind so that they are able to learn and develop in later years. At the same time, there are a whole host of people in my state, even me being among them, who would be somewhat alarmed at the notion of the government taking an intrusive role in raising infants. This is just something that I think would be troubling to many Americans. So the question is, how do you make those kind of experiences and opportunities available to people across income categories at the same time without unduly intruding into the family unit and appearing to substitute the government for the role of parents, which I do not think is something that would be good for the country or politically sustainable. So I think early childhood education, we have too many kids who show up in kindergarten or first grade already developmentally a couple years behind. They can catch up. It's just a lot harder when that's the case. So I would think in the long term a focus on that as well. But some of the things I mentioned to you, does that at least in part answer or respond to your question?
Good enough.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
My name is Jeff Yarbrough. I'm a junior at the college, and I was listening to your remarks, and I was standing next to one of my friends who's a conservative Republican, and he said that, about halfway through, he looked over and said, there's not a thing he said so far that I disagree with. So my question for you is how would you respond to the criticism that sort of your governing philosophy, or I guess what would be characterized as new Democrat philosophy, is an abandonment of the core Democratic principles in us?
Sure.
Into
Well, that's a very good question. Where are you from, Jeff?
Tennessee.
Good. I was very fond of your former governor, Ned Ray McWhirter, very nice man. Let me explain my philosophy to you. I do think that there is a growing consensus among Democrats, Republicans, and independents, at least a majority of all three, about some things, about the importance of sound financial management for our country. I think we've seen what can happen in our own country when we allow deficits to grow as far as the eye can see. I think you can see in Asia recently what can happen when a society really lets its finances get out of control. And as someone who views himself as a progressive, I will say this: I've governed in good times and I've governed in bad times, and let me tell you, the people who are hurt first and hurt most when a government verges on bankruptcy are the people who rely upon it to create opportunity. If you're going to have the money to invest in education and health care and protecting the environment and the other things we care about, it has to be over the long term on a sound financial foundation. You can run temporary deficits, but in the long run, huge deficits are just unsustainable. So I think it is a good thing that there's a growing consensus about the importance of sound financial management. I think it's a good thing there's a growing consensus about the importance of economic growth. That is the engine that creates the financial resources to help the less fortunate. That is the engine that allows us to have employment for, and hopefully rising incomes for people who are in need. And I think that you're seeing a bipartisan consensus, and not always with agreement, but at least with regard to the goal that economic growth is a good thing. And some members of the Democratic Party who used to ignore that just as perhaps we didn't pay as much attention to the importance of financial management, I think there's a growing consensus that, well, we need to look at how we be competitive. What is our advantage internationally in a much more difficult competitive world? If we don't focus on that, we will all suffer. The well-to-do as well as the less fortunate, probably the more less fortunate. Final thing, and it relates to your question, is I think there's a growing consensus about how best to implement some of the goals that as a society we believe strongly in. And a large top-down management structure with micromanaging from afar, I think has been proven both in the private sector and increasingly in the public sector to just not be effective. So if you care about helping the less fortunate, it ought to be, you ought to do it in ways that will actually work. Now, having said that, there are some philosophical differences in some of the social areas with regard to some of individual liberties, basic rights, things of that nature, and with regard to how to achieve some of economic growth, fiscal priorities within the accepted parameters of balancing the federal budget. There are certainly differences, but I don't view it as a bad thing that when it comes to sound finances, economic growth, and effective management, that there is some consensus. I think that is a good thing, not a bad thing. And but there are important areas of difference about how to achieve some of those objectives, and within the realm of constitutional rights, liberties, personal freedom, some of those things, fundamental differences of opinion between the parties and people who consider themselves New Democrats and people who consider themselves to be follow a different political faith. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very
a
much.
little bit? Okay.
Good evening, Governor. My name is Will Monahan. I'm from Kentucky, and I'm a junior here at the college. My question, well, you spoke about how market forces could play a positive role in devolution, and I guess I can see a corollary to that with respect to welfare reform. A common criticism is that there could be a race to the bottom now that we have now with a new reform in place, especially if the economy turns sour and we have a downturn. How would you respond to that, and do you see a downside for market forces with respect to devolution?
First, Will, thank you for your question. I wish you'd keep beating us in basketball as badly as you do. That's in our state, that's a terrible blow to our state pride. But
We'll try.
Okay, I appreciate it. You know, I've read that, and while in theory I suppose that's possible, I just don't think as a practical matter you're going to see that happening. I mean, the theory, for those of you who haven't followed this, goes something along the following lines: that states will cut their social safety net, will reduce their welfare benefits dramatically in an attempt to be more economically competitive. The reason I don't think that's going to happen is that the size of the dollars you're talking about simply is not that great in terms of you know, a state budget. The big area of social expenditure and welfare are not actually the cash payments to the families, it's the Medicaid benefits. And I don't see any state going out and dramatically slashing health care benefits. I just don't think conservatives, liberals, or anybody in between would be in favor of that sort of thing. So while theoretically possible, I just don't think, you know, look, Wisconsin has a lot higher welfare benefits than Indiana, for example. And there you occasionally read some anecdotal evidence about people getting on the bus and, you know, going to Wisconsin and applying for welfare benefits. I just don't think that you're going to see a state dramatically slash their social safety net to address that phenomenon. We haven't seen any evidence of that to date. Now, the economy is very strong. Next time we have a recession, as I suspect will occur sometime in our lifetimes, welfare reform will really be put to the acid test, and we may have to revisit some of these things in light of our experience. But I have just seen nothing to indicate that that sort of thing is going to happen in states governed by Democrats or by Republicans. You want to follow up?
No, that's all right. Thank you.
I just don't see as there's a different phenomena taking place there, and it's really the social compact, and there are two sides of the social compact. Number one is hopefully the responsibility all of us feel to every member in society, no matter how vulnerable, that when they get down on their luck through no fault of their own, we try and extend a helping hand to say, look, we want you to have an opportunity to make something of your life. And the flip side of that is the responsibility that each individual who is being helped has to make the most of that opportunity. And I think what you have going on is that there are a whole lot of folks in the economy who work every day for $7, $8, $9, $10 an hour, sometimes without health care benefits. And to keep faith with those people, I think it's important we also require the folks who we're trying to help have that same dedication to work ethic, making something of themselves. So it's a two-way street. I think that's what's driving a lot of the reform, not an effort to save money, because with regard to the cash payments, you just don't save that much.
Thanks.
And Medicaid I don't see being slashed because I just don't. That's not going to happen.
Thanks.
Yes.
Yes, good evening. My name is John Coriel. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I'm from Florida. I'm also the conservative that Jeff was talking to. My question is, given that I agree with most of what you said about how government should and does impact the economic or private sector of society, I'm wondering what you think about how business in turn affects the government, particularly given your desire to be in the Senate and what's recently been going on with campaign finance reform. I'm wondering what you think the appropriate balance is and whether or not you favor any of the reforms currently talked about. Would you have voted for recent measures, or do you have something else in mind?
Your question is directed at campaign finance reforms.
That's right.
John, you talked a little bit about the relationship between business and government. Well, I can tell you as someone who is in the process at this time, my own belief is that it is in serious need of improvement and change. The First Amendment, of course, is vitally important and does place some important restrictions on our ability to grapple with this problem. I personally would have voted for the McCain-Feingold proposal before Congress. It's not perfect, but there is something out of kilter, and Senator Simpson has been involved longer than, or at least as long as I, and Phil longer than I. After we're done here, you might want to ask them their opinion. They may have a different opinion, but there's something wrong when people who seek important public policy positions spend more than half of the time that they devote to public matters involved with fundraising. You should have to prove your credibility. You should have to raise some funds, but if it gets to the point where you're spending half or 60 or 70% in search of funding the next television commercial, that's just a system that's out of whack. Now, given the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, it is a difficult thing to deal with because you have independent expenditure groups, and the national parties, apparently under their interpretation of the Constitution, have an unlimited ability to raise these large contributions and then spend them through the state parties on so-called issue advocacy, as long as you don't, quote-unquote, coordinate that with the candidate. And the definition of coordination seems to have gotten pretty thin here over the passage of time. So I can tell you, John, that I think it is a very important problem if we're going to restore the public's confidence and faith in the process. I don't have a perfect answer. I'm in search of one, but at least I think we can start. Let's take, for example, these soft money contributions, the $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 contributions. If we do nothing else, perhaps we can take that element out of the McCain-Feingold bill and say maybe we can at least agree that that's a place to start, and then work out from there. So it's something that concerns me greatly. I think we need to deal with it. It's difficult given the and also it's difficult because each side tends to define reform in terms of how to dry up the other side's money. And as long as we look at it that way, we're unlikely to ever get anything done. So since you were, let me return to Jeff's point for 1 second, since you were kind enough to ask that question. I do think one of the philosophical distinctions that occasionally exist, markets are wonderfully efficient things at allocating resources, and I believe in them. But markets also aren't perfect, and markets occasionally markets can also be pretty rough instruments. And my own view, and I think one thing that would characterize so-called New Democrats, is the belief in markets, yes, but also an appropriate role for government initiative to try and create opportunity for those who, through no fault of their own, may not be able to successfully compete in the market without education, healthcare, some other basic building blocks. And there are some who take a more Darwinian view of things, but I don't mean that pejoratively. So markets are important, but there is a debate about what the appropriate role is in empowering people to compete and succeed within a market-based system, and that can be a distinction. Did I answer your question at least a little bit about campaign finance reform?
Yes, you did.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Governor, hello. My name's Patrick Curran. I'm a freshman at the college from Massachusetts. And I wanted to touch for a moment again on welfare reform. We've seen some states like Indiana and like Wyoming do very well and reduce welfare rolls by placing people into good jobs with good pay. But we've seen other states, like Mississippi, go a different path. These are states that have reduced their welfare rolls without placing people into any jobs, but simply abandoning them. And in areas like the Mississippi Delta, where there simply are no jobs, people find themselves without jobs, not for lack of initiative, but because there's nowhere to work and there's no place to go. As someone who's concerned by this, I was wondering what you could say to myself or to people perhaps like me in this audience to quiet those concerns in a system where there is not a clear national mechanism for control.
Very good question, and I think that we're going to see, as I mentioned, the acid test of all this the next time we have a recession, and jobs may not quite be so plentiful. And I think we need to keep an open mind to fine-tuning what we've done and to revisiting what we've done in the light of the experience that we have at that time. I should also say, and then I'll get directly to your question, the 40 or 45% reduction we've seen in our state so far, and I suspect in most other states, that's a wonderful thing. These people are now working, supporting themselves. It's a wonderful thing, but that's the easy part. You start off with people who have some work experience, some education experience, who are motivated. And the further you go down the roles, the more you're getting into people with, sixth grade education, someone who may be second generation, never had a job on public support, someone with substance abuse problems, perhaps some other problems that have been impediments for them being self-supporting. And I think you've got to recognize that the further you go, the more difficult it gets, but still you try. I'm not familiar with Mississippi's experience, but I can share with you in our own case, we received a waiver. Not always were the administrators enthusiastic about it, but to their credit, they did give us the ability. We have a work requirement in Indiana now where if a job is available, you have to take the job. You can't say it doesn't pay enough or you don't like it. You have to take the job, because we felt that there are advantages that come from work, from keeping a schedule, to showing up, to being productive in a whole host of ways in addition to economic. Now, if an area of the state, and we had in mind in particular one of our central cities, if an area of the state, and it can be demonstrated that the economy is simply, there are not jobs available, then we had an exception to that, recognizing that you can't expect someone to do the impossible. And that's one reason why transportation is an important part of this answer. If someone is living, if there are dislocations, getting back to the rural markets, if there are imperfections in the market that prevent people from taking advantage of opportunities, let's say that the southern part of Lake County is is growing rapidly, which it is, generating a lot of jobs, which it is, but Gary is not doing quite so well, and there is not adequate public transportation for people to get from Gary to southern Lake County to take advantage of those jobs, then that's a barrier that we have to look at overcoming to allow the market to function appropriately. And so we did have that. I'm not, the Mississippi Delta may be something of an analogy. If there just are not jobs, you can't expect people to do the impossible, but that's why transportation is an important part of the answer. Did that,
Yeah,
Patrick?
definitely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Governor, it's indeed a pleasure to meet you. My name's Don Morris, and I hail from Hammond, Indiana. I've been bugging Phil Sharp for 3 years about when you were going to show up.
That's the part of the state I was just referring to in answering Patrick's question.
Yes, it is. Much of what you talked about tonight has been about tools to improve people's lives. I was wondering if you would kind of expand on that a little bit more past education and welfare. Much of what you've talked about has been in step with the administration. Any other areas, federal or state, you think that might be applicable to?
In terms of empowering people to
Yes,
make
sir.
the most of opportunity in their lives?
Yes, sir.
Well,
I realize that's pretty broad. I can't talk anymore because my throat's kind of scratchy.
Okay. Well, why don't you save your voice and I'll waste mine here, and if you want to ask a follow-up, go ahead. Well, the reason I dwelt so much upon education and training is that I really do believe that it is one of the critical elements of individual as well as societal opportunity in the next century. I mean, you really, and one of the things that I was heartened to see in my travels around our state, I would go to a lot of schools, and I could see, one of the things that always, how do you get the audience's attention, particularly when they're 8th graders? This is not an, some of them were there because they had to be, they weren't particularly interested in hearing from the governor, so I always started off by asking for a show of hands. I'd say, how many of you want to grow up one day and make a lot of money? And in all my travels, not a hand failed to go up. And then I'd ask a second question. That got their attention. They go, yeah, this is good. And then I ask a second question. I'd say, all right, how many of you think you'll do that someday? Make a lot of money, be prosperous. How many of you think you'll do that if you don't know very much? And much to my pleasant surprise, never a hand went up. And I'd say to those students, I'd say, well, you understand. You now know it's important. You now know the importance of your presence here. And I'd bring in business people. My last couple years in office, I'd bring in business people, and I'd say, look, you don't have to listen to me. Mr. Smith here, or Miss Smith, she owns the XYZ company. Maybe some of your parents work for XYZ. And Miss Smith's going to come up here after I'm done, and she's going to tell you what it takes to work at her company. You got to read and write. You got to add and subtract. You got to know some other basic skills. You got to show up on time. And boy, they were on the edge of their seat listening to the person who'd be actually doing the hiring who would come up. So the reason I dwell upon education is I do think it is the critical element necessary for individuals to compete and succeed in the next century and for our country collectively. And I just am concerned that we are making progress, but we have a whole lot more still to go. And I am afraid that there's a connection between not only our economic competitiveness, but our social well-being if we don't meet the educational challenge in terms of the drug problem and teen pregnancy and juvenile violence and some of these things. So that's one thing I think certainly the government needs to focus on. Research and development, things of that nature can be very important to creating opportunity. We need to focus upon a regulatory and legal structure that we insist upon outcomes, but we have an efficient mechanism for allowing the private sector to achieve those outcomes. There are other, in healthcare, for example, very important. I think this is a sleeper issue over the next few years. I think this is going to come back in a very strong way as we have this debate in our country about how do we ensure quality at the same time we have affordability. And this is going to be at times an emotional thing. There's part of us, each one of us, we want unlimited choice and unlimited access, and yet at the same time, it's got to be affordable. And we have to look for a way out of that box where it's just a complete trade-off, where we have a false choice between quality and affordability. We have to find some way to achieve both. Obviously, the government is the largest payer for health care through Medicaid and Medicare. I think it's vitally important to our children's well-being, and I know Senator Simpson worked very hard on this, to have a debate about what we're going to do about entitlement reform in our country. There's a lot of debate today about what to do with the budget surplus, which I feel may be somewhat illusory. If we don't solve Social Security, my children and your children are going to pay for this problem. So we have to give some thought about how to provide decent retirements for people at the same time while we give ourselves the resources to invest in our children's productivity, which will allow them to earn the incomes, which then will help to generate the revenue to pay for the retirement system. So there are a whole host of things we need to be doing, but I touched upon and I mentioned some of them here. The environment's also an important issue. Law and order is an important issue. Many people are concerned about particularly the drug problem. And I could go on and on about that. But so there are many things we need to do. But if I had to just pick one thing, quality education, empowering people with the skills to be competitive in the new economy is, I think, our greatest challenge. So I hope your voice gets better. Yes?
Hi, my name is Luther Williams, and I'm a freshman here at the college. I come from California. And I wanted to know what sort of mechanisms the federal government would keep in order to keep the standards, the national standards, to the states themselves that existed during the time of, say, the waivers that was for welfare beforehand, when if a state somehow did the race to the bottom that Will mentioned before, the federal government could step in and say, these are the standards that we have to keep, now we have to take over. I was wondering if you advocate similar standards for the national government.
In terms of education?
Well, no, welfare reform, yeah, education too, because that's what you've been talking about.
Well, I think the structure that we may be evolving to, and I would put constitutional rights and some other basic agreed upon priorities in a different category. There are some parts of the American experience that we just will guarantee as a people to every citizen in our country. That will not vary from state to state. Putting those aside and dealing with some other things, education, welfare, some other things, provision of some other services, I think we're moving to a system where the federal government will establish standards, allow some experimentation in meeting them, provide resources and hold states accountable. Now you're asking me, what if the state just falls down on the job and chronically fails to meet those standards? Well, at that point, then obviously you'd have to revisit the situation and understand why that's happening. Is it something beyond the state's control, or is it just that they tried an experiment or innovation that happened to not work, and then they are not willing to acknowledge that and try something else? So I think we'd have to just, take a look at the particulars. You have a particular area in mind?
Well, I mean, welfare reform was one of the questions. Now that it's gone back to the states, I just wanted to know, even though much of the work has already been done on that, if you could extrapolate possibly to education. I was just wondering, I mean, if the states do somehow get off a track, how is the federal government supposed to?
I'll give you an
come in?
example. The federal government is providing funding for daycare. Very important. I mentioned transportation. It's hard to tell a single mother to go out and get a job if she's got a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old infant, and there's no relative nearby, there's no one to take care of the children. That's not a practical situation. So the federal government is acknowledging that. Some states have stepped up to the plate, providing more in daycare assistance. The federal government is too. But what the federal government's saying, Luther, is we're going to provide funding because we think quality child care is important, but states, and we're going to give you the money, you can't go and use this money for you can't go and decide as a state, well, we're going to spend it on highway construction. It's got to be dedicated for the purpose that we're offering it. Now, you can try and look for different ways to provide quality child care, but that's what it has to go to. So there's experimentation allowed, but it's got to be within the sort of the core area that the money's being provided for. So that's one example of some continued federal oversight of the funding.
Thank you.
And I do think in the area of education standards, I think, in fact, that rather than a race to the bottom, you'll see it work the other way around. I think you could see states competing with higher standards, trying to create a better education system as a lure for investment and business expansion in their state, because that's a lot of what businesses are looking for these days. So I think in that area, you might actually have a virtuous race to the top. Thank you for your question. Maybe I unfortunately have this plane. I'll try and do these real quick. If you can make your questions quick, I'll try and answer likewise.
Yes, my name is Jessica Johnson. I'm a first-year Master's in Public Policy student here from LaPorte, Indiana. My
wonderful.
question for you is, our Master's in Public Policy first-year students are spending these 2 weeks studying Social Security reform in depth. And given that this is a top issue for voters, at least it was polled recently that this is the #2 issue voters are concerned about, do you think changes are necessary? What type of changes might you support? And how do you think that you all will be able to overcome the politics of the situation to actually make changes happen? That was a quickie for you.
Unfortunately, I don't have time to answer that question in the way you deserve to have it answered. Let me start in reverse. I do think there will be a window of opportunity to address this issue within the political process after the election, but before the next presidential election heats up. So I hope that with the president putting it on the table, with the leaders in Congress expressing an interest in dealing with this, that we will have a window of opportunity there to sort of say, look, we're all in this together, and let's not try and skewer each other on this issue and actually do something. So that's how you handle it. Do it after the election, but before the presidential heats up. With regard to the policy, there are a whole lot of things we need to look at. Let me just throw one out for you, and I would say this talk about using surpluses. I do agree with something the president said, and some others have said. I see the speakers now saying a little bit about this. This talk about using this so-called surplus until we've solved entitlements, I just think is putting the cart before the horse. We need to resolve the entitlement Social Security issue first, and then look at the rest of the budget. So that's one thing. Other thing I'd say, this whole issue of the rate of return that we are earning upon the funds in Social Security, I think, is an important one. And if there are some things that we can do to generate a higher rate of return of even a percentage point or two, that does go a long way toward dealing with some of the actuarial problems we have. Now, if you get into equity investments, you obviously got to deal with the question of risk. I'm enough of a contrarian that as soon as the federal government starts investing in the stock market, that's got to be a clear sign to sell. It's although I guess that wasn't Chili's experience, but in any event, if there's some way to generate a larger rate of return while still managing the risk, and then you get the whole issue that we don't have time to discuss here about individual versus collective decisions. I tend to look at this as a safety net issue, and we can talk about that later, maybe when you come home and visit sometime. But those are some of my thoughts about that. It is a very potentially volatile issue, but I think we have a chance on both sides of the aisle to come together and do something about this. And if we're going to do it, we ought to fix it in a way that'll last for 50 years, not just it's going to put off the collapse 3 or 4. That's not why you're sent there. So those are some of my thoughts about that.
Thank you.
Very fast, and I apologize again.
My name is PJ Oswald. I'm a first year from Iowa, and I just wanted to ask you, you have 2 young sons yourself who in 15 or 16 years will be heading off to college, and you've referred to the possibility of development of a class-based society in America, and you're a little bit afraid of that possibility. And I wondered, one of the keys to avoiding that situation is to provide equal opportunity to education for everyone. In keeping the budget surplus, there's going to be belt tightening around the federal budget, and I wondered if you had any particular methods in mind to protect the portion of the federal budget that goes to providing financial aid for college-bound high school students and protecting that money.
I didn't mention that in the other education questions. We were focusing more upon K through 12, but I think that is very important and one of the best returns on an investment that we can make. I mean, the statistics are overwhelming about how much better economically people with a college education do than those who have not had the benefit of college. And so it's a question of priorities. And the relentless belt tightening has been helped greatly by some of the caps enacted by Congress, and also a great deal by the robust economy. So hopefully we're not in a position where we got to be cranking down on things like college loans. But all I can say to you is that would be possibly the last place that I would look for savings, because I think in the long run it's a great investment for our society, and one of the things that allows people to pull themselves from a disadvantaged situation into one of opportunity. So it's a question of just setting priorities. We had to cut the budget when I was governor, and we still managed to increase education funding every year. We had to cut it during the recession when we increased funding when times were better. But you just got to sit down and look at priorities. But thankfully, because of the progress we've made to date on the budget, hopefully we're in a position to expand college assistance as opposed to cutting it. And even if at some point in the future we did have to look at additional cuts, that would be, as I said, possibly the last place I would look.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
That was terrific, informative, and as with all terrific people, you always would like to have more. My job is only to thank you all for coming. Evan, thank you for being at Harvard. We hope you'll be here again soon. We hope you'll have more time. And I know that Evan would welcome follow-up questions from any of you. Track him down, send them to me. I'll get them to him, and we'll continue this dialogue.
We actually got a web page. I don't have you can find it out there someplace.
Okay. He's got a web page. That's pretty cool. Okay, thank you. Good night.
Wow. Yeah, it was good.
Hi. How are you?
But, I mean, I like that he focuses on education because I think that's what everyone should be doing, but at the same time, it drives me nuts. What is like the most...